All right, here we are, and we are going to do a couple of lectures. You guys can watch these videos. Hopefully they turn out. And then I'm also going to do a short screencast-o-matic with Wireshark, very short. And then I'm going to do a short one with switching, and you'll see a reference to that in the second lecture. But let's get through this first one first. It's fairly short, and hopefully this works for you guys. We're going to talk about multiple access methods. This is what do you do when you have a wire and there are lots of computers on it, and you got to have some way to control the access to that wire or to a radio frequency. And we're going to start in Hawaii. And that's why we have this quote up here by Buck Buchanan: "A day without aloha is just another mainland day," which is where we live every single day. So we're moving on up. We did the physical layer last week. Today we're going to do, actually 2 weeks ago, today we're going to do Layer 2, media access control. It's about agreeing who gets to talk when they on the wire. And there are three types. You got your random access, you got your controlled access, you got your channelization. Random access is what Ethernet does. It's what radios do a lot of times. You've got first come, first serve. Anybody can talk whenever they want. And you could come up with a random access that allows people to talk, and they don't even have to stop talking if someone interrupts them. Or you could do more like what most DataCom systems do if they're random access. They talk, but while they're talking, they listen. If there's someone else begins to talk, then they back up and they try to have some way to negotiate who's going to get to go next. You also have controlled access. You could have a polling system where one person asks everyone else, do you have anything to say? Do you have anything to say? Do you have anything to say? That would be a polling system. You could have tokens where you have like a special flower. And if you have the flower, you're allowed to talk. And if you're done talking, you pass the flower to the next person in the circle, and then they can talk. But if they don't want to talk, they can pass the flower on. So that's a token. The token allows you to talk. Or you can have channelization. This would be analogous to a TV. You guys remember what TVs are, hopefully, at least the old style TVs where there'd be channel 3, 4, 5, and 6. All of the channels are broadcasting at the same time, but they're all in their own channel, so they can all transmit at the same time. All right, so the very early random access protocol was developed at the University of Hawaii, and it allowed them to talk to each other, send radio signals from any island to any other island. They had these broadcast stations. When a broadcast station had data to send, would just transmit it. The others would listen and receive it. The problem would be that there's this propagation delay between the islands. And let's say the maximum propagation delay between any two islands was, let's just pick anything, 100 milliseconds. So it could be that you would listen on the far eastern island and say, hey, nobody's talking, I can talk. And you would start to talk, and at that same moment, somebody on the far western island would listen, and they'd say, hey, there's nobody talking, and they would start to talk, and about 50 milliseconds later, your radio waves would cross each other in the middle between, and a collision would begin. And eventually, the other island that was talking, their radio signal would reach you while you were talking, and you'd say, oh, we're talking over each other. And you would try to have some way to not have a collision. Now, in Aloha protocol, you would just pick a random time. You would try again and hope for the best. How did it work? Not very good. Low usage rate due to high collisions. Only about 18.4% successful throughput. Ew, that was terrible. So, remember I said that the maximum time between any two stations was 100 milliseconds? That's the propagation delay. So you could say, you know what? You need to listen for 100 milliseconds before you transmit. And that way, if somebody else has started at the same time you want to start, then you will, what will you do? Then you won't walk over them. But that doesn't really do anything because it's still random. But if we make everyone start on the same 100 millisecond clock signals, then people will only start at 0.1, 0.2, 0.3, 0.4, and it actually doubles the throughput. It reduces the likelihood of a random collision. If everyone says, I want to talk, and they wait until the next clock signal, and then they listen through a full clock signal, if no one talks, there's a much better chance that no one is talking. So that helped. Then along came Ethernet. A guy named Bob Metcalf, I believe he was working for Xerox, was inventing this data communications thing. He created, let's get a pen up here. We'll get a red pen, I think. He created a bus technology. This is how traditional Ethernet was drawn. and you would connect systems to it, and the systems could talk to each other. How did they do it? When you want to talk, listen. If nobody's talking, you transmit. And if somebody is talking, you wait until they quit. Looks a lot like the Hawaiian Islands, where people can talk through the air. And so what he did was he said, I like this Aloha protocol, but what I'm going to do is, I'm going to erase all that. I am going to create something called carrier sense. There's our carrier sense. And that means I'm going to listen. I'm going to sense the wire. If I don't hear anybody talking, I can talk. He added MA, multiple access, which reminds everyone there are multiple stations on the wire. And finally, collision detect. He said, you know what? You have to keep listening once you start talking. And this is carrier sense, multiple access, collision detect. And this is how Ethernet still works to this day. If you want to transmit, you have to listen first. Then, remembering that there are other people, you have to continue to listen while you talk to see if there's a collision. So what if two stations at the opposite ends of the wire send very tiny packets? Let's imagine that we have Bob and Carrie. That's a C for Carrie. And they start transmitting. But it takes, again, let's get a little smaller. Let's say if Bob sends a bit here at his end, then it takes, this is going to be bad, takes 10 microseconds to reach the far end. So during that 10 microseconds, somebody else might start transmitting. Now, he can send 1 bit per microsecond. So he sends a 3-bit waveform down the wire. It takes him 3 microseconds to do that. And when he starts, it's time 0. And when he ends, it's time 3 microseconds. And here's where the first bit is. It's right there. It's traveling down the wire, but it hasn't stopped. A couple microseconds later, his packet, his 3-bit packet is here. And almost 10 microseconds later, his 3-bit packet is right here. Now, I'm going to do some erasing. Let's see if I can get that eraser up here. Get rid of that and get rid of that. Because now, Carrie, who's going to be, I better not use blue. That won't work very well. I'll use green. Carrie, here's green Carrie. Here's his computer. Carrie sends a 3-bit packet down the wire. And now you can see a problem because this packet is going to leave Carrie and it's going to go down here. And Bob's packet is going to come here. And the 2 packets are going to collide. It's going to be a big mess, just like my thing. And what happens when they collide? Well, Bob and Carrie don't have any idea. So they think everything was fine because the packets essentially collided in the middle and then they were so small that they didn't actually see anything. So how do we fix this? We say if the wire has a 10 microsecond propagation delay width, then you, Mr. Carey, must transmit at least for 10 microseconds. Now, that means if he can transmit 1 bit per microsecond, and he has to transmit for exactly 10 or at least 10 microseconds, that means he's going to have to send at least 10 bits. And the same thing is going to be true for Bob. So what we're going to do is we're going to find out what's the propagation delay of the end-to-end transmission on the wire, and then we're going to say you have to transmit at least that many bits. And so we have a minimum size on Ethernet. And what is the minimum size on Ethernet? The minimum size on Ethernet is 64 bytes or 512 bits. Keep that in mind. It's going to come up a lot. And later when you say, well, why do we have a minimum Ethernet size? Oh, man, how did that survive? Oh, I know how that survived. Let's get rid of that. The reason we have a minimum packet size is because we used to have these collisions. Now, collisions are far less of a problem now because of switching. We'll look at that as we get deeper into Ethernet. Just keep in mind there's a minimum packet size on Ethernet. Now, what happens if you were transmitting and you did have a collision? You and Bob have a collision. How do you transmit? Or how do you get out of that? Well, you both back off, and there's an exponential back off. And here's how it works. If you wait, I'm probably going to get this a little wrong, but the idea is right. You wait 2 to the n plus 1 cycles. And n equals the number of collisions you've encountered while you're trying to transmit. So if this is your third time trying to transmit, then you're going to wait up to 7 cycles. So if n equals 3, then 2 to the n plus 1. Actually, that's not right. That's 2 to the 4th. So there's 16. But what you do is you say, I'm going to pick a random number from 0 to 16. So that if somebody else has also had their third attempt and failed, they will also pick a random number between 1 and 16, and one of you will pick a lower number and transmit. If it was your first time, that would be 2 to the 2 to the 1 plus 1. I think that's where I went wrong. It's actually just 2 to the n, but you get the idea. Then you would wait up to 2 to the 4th. I'm going to continue with my error, which would be 4 possible cycles. You pick a random number between 0 and 4, and that's how long you wait. And so it's called exponential back-off. And we have our 2 back-off bears here. And so it's kind of unfair, because if you've had 3 collisions and somebody else tries to transmit for their first time at the same time, and they create a collision with you and it's your third, they're much more likely to go before you. That's just Ethernet. That's just the way Ethernet works. So Ethernet, is it better or worse than a low hawk? Guess what? It is better, but the max throughput still pretty much stinks. It's less than 50% on an old style Ethernet bus wire. Now, if you really try to jam packets onto Ethernet, you can get a little better than 50%, but you will be operating at low successful transmission rates. Token passing schemes are better, so why aren't they used? And I already explained that a couple of weeks ago. IBM owned Token Ring. That was a token passing scheme. They held on to it and didn't allow it to become an open standard, and as a result, it was expensive, so people didn't use it. Even though Ethernet is not as good of a medium as Token Ring, Ethernet is much, much cheaper, and so from a dollar per bit standpoint, it's a better choice, even though technically it's not. Okay, so what do I want you to remember here? First of all, remember that multiple access media like Ethernet have to have a method to share the microphone. You can have polling, random, or channelization. And Ethernet is random, which makes it terrible. So we'll also be studying Ethernet primarily as our MAC media transmission protocol. And that's because Ethernet is ubiquitous, and so you need to understand it. And you must memorize carrier sense, multiple access collision detect. Carrier sense, listen first. I'll put an ugly ear here. There we go. Listen first. Remember, there are lots of people. Oh, man. All right, lots of people. Give this guy some hair. And then you have to listen for collisions and then know how Ethernet reacts. It backs off and waits a random number from 0 to 2 to the n, where n is the number of collisions that you've had. That is the end of that slideshow. Huzzah!